Story 1. The Mirror Convoy. Marcus Chen had been hauling freight across the Southwest for 12 years, and in all that time he'd developed an unshakable routine. Every Tuesday night, he'd take the I-40 stretch through the Arizona desert, delivering electronics from Phoenix to Albuquerque. The route was so he could practically drive it with his eyes closed, which is why what happened on October 17, 2019, shook him to his core. The night started normally enough. Marcus left the Phoenix distribution center at 10 p.m. sharp, his Kenworth loaded with flat-screen televisions and monitors. The weather was clear, temperature hovering around 65 degrees, perfect driving conditions. He had his CB radio tuned to channel 19, his thermos of black coffee in the cup holder, and his GPS showing an estimated arrival time of 3:47. Everything was exactly as it should be. Around midnight, he was about 40 miles east of Holbrook when he noticed headlights in his mirror. Another semi, moving at roughly the same speed, maintaining a steady distance of maybe 300 yards behind him. This wasn't unusual. Truckers often ended up traveling in loose convoys, especially on long, empty stretches of highway. What struck Marcus as odd was how perfectly the truck seemed to match his speed. When he accelerated slightly, it accelerated. When he eased off the gas, it slowed down proportionally. Marcus keyed his CB radio. "Hey there, driver behind me on the eastbound 40, you got your ears on." Static crackled back at him, but no response. He tried again. "This is Big Buddha eastbound at mile marker 289, looking to chat with the Freightliner behind me." Still nothing but the soft hiss of dead air. He shrugged it off and kept driving. Maybe the guy's radio was broken, or he was one of those antisocial types who didn't like company. Marcus had encountered plenty of those over the years, but as another 20 miles rolled past, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The truck behind him never varied its distance, never drifted into the other lane, never fell back or pulled closer. It was like it was tethered to his rig by an invisible chain. Then Marcus noticed something that made his skin prickle. The truck behind him looked identical to his own. Same model Kenworth W900, same configuration, even what appeared to be the same color scheme in his mirrors, though it was hard to tell in the darkness. He told himself it was just a coincidence. Kenworths were popular, and plenty of independent operators chose their setups. But when he glanced at his passenger side mirror during a gentle curve in the highway, his breath caught. The truck wasn't just similar. It was identical, right down to the small dent in the front bumper that Marcus had gotten 3 months ago in a parking lot incident in Flagstaff. He could even make out what looked like the same mud flaps, the same pattern of running lights. Marcus felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He increased his speed to 75, pushing past the legal limit. The truck behind him matched pace instantly, as if controlled by the same accelerator. He tried the CB again, his voice less friendly now. "All right, whoever you are back there, this isn't funny. Back off or pass me, but quit following me like this." The radio crackled, and for a moment Marcus thought he heard something. Not words exactly, but a sound like wind rushing through a tunnel, or maybe a voice speaking backwards. Then silence again. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. He told himself to stay calm, to think rationally. Maybe it was just another driver playing a prank, someone who happened to have a similar truck and found it amusing to mess with him. But that didn't explain how the other driver could have the same dent, the same mud flaps, the same everything. At mile marker 312, Marcus made a decision. There was a rest area coming up in 2 miles, and he'd pull in, let this creep pass him, and put some distance between them. He turned on his signal well in advance, watching his mirrors carefully. The truck behind him signaled at the exact same moment. Marcus felt his heart hammering now. He slowed down, taking the exit ramp to the rest area. The other truck followed, maintaining that same impossible distance. The rest area was mostly empty, just a couple of cars in the parking lot and one other semi parked at the far end near the restrooms. Marcus pulled into a spot under one of the bright overhead lights, his hands shaking slightly as he set the parking brake. He looked in his mirror, watching the entrance to the rest area. The other truck rolled in, its lights cutting through the darkness, and pulled into a spot directly behind him, perhaps 50 feet back. For a long moment, Marcus just sat there, trying to decide what to do. Then he saw the driver's door of the other truck open, and a figure climbed down. The overhead lights cast strange shadows, making it hard to see clearly, but something about the figure's silhouette was familiar. The way it moved, the build, even the slight limp in the right leg that Marcus had developed after a motorcycle accident 10 years ago. The figure walked toward Marcus, and as it passed under a light, Marcus felt his blood turn to ice water. He was looking at himself, not someone who resembled him, not a brother or a twin he'd never known about. It was him down to the scar on his left cheek, the way his work jacket hung slightly crooked on his shoulders, even the specific model of work boots he was wearing. Marcus fumbled for his door lock, making sure it was secured. The other Marcus, his doppelganger, walked slowly toward his truck, not hurrying, just a steady, purposeful approach. When it reached the driver's side door, it stopped and looked up at him. Its face was exactly his face, but the eyes were wrong. They were flat and dead, like a photograph of eyes rather than living ones. The thing that wore his face raised its hand and knocked on the door, 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Then it spoke, and its voice was Marcus's voice, but it came from everywhere at once, inside the cab and outside simultaneously. "You need to let me in," it said. "You need to let me drive." Marcus grabbed his cell phone, his fingers clumsy with fear, and tried to dial 911. But the screen showed no signal, even though he'd had full bars just minutes ago. He tried the CB radio, shouting into the microphone, calling for anyone to respond, to come help him. Nothing but that strange, rushing wind sound came back. The doppelganger knocked again, harder this time, and the entire truck shook with the impact. "You don't understand," it said. "I'm supposed to be driving. You're the one who shouldn't be here. You took my route, my life, my timeline. I need it back." Marcus started the engine, his only thought to get away, to escape this nightmare. But when he looked forward, he saw his truck, his exact truck, parked directly in front of him, blocking him in. He looked in his mirror, and another identical truck had appeared behind him, then another on his left side, and another on his right. He was surrounded by copies of his own rig, and from each one, a version of himself was climbing out. They all converged on his truck, a dozen Marcus Chens, all wearing the same clothes, all moving with that same purposeful stride. They surrounded the cab, pressing their hands against the windows, all of them speaking at once in a chorus of his own voice. "Let us in. You're in the wrong place. This is our route, our life, our timeline. You have to choose which one you are." Marcus screamed, a raw sound of pure terror. He threw the truck into reverse, not caring about the vehicles around him, and stomped on the accelerator. The Kenworth lurched backward, and he felt impacts, heard the crunch of metal, but he didn't stop. He cranked the wheel hard, spinning the truck in a wild arc, and then drive, flooring it toward the rest area exit. In his mirrors, he saw all the duplicate trucks starting up, their lights flooding on in perfect synchronization. They followed him back onto the highway, forming a convoy of identical vehicles, all piloted by identical drivers. Marcus pushed his truck to its limits, the engine roaring, the speedometer climbing past 80, then 90. The convoy kept pace effortlessly. For the next hour, Marcus drove in absolute terror, unable to shake his pursuers. They maintained formation behind him, beside him, when the highway widened, a fleet of impossible duplicates. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. At mile marker 387, just as the first light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, the other trucks simply vanished. One moment they were there, and the next, Marcus was alone on an empty highway. He pulled over immediately, his whole body shaking, and sat there for 20 minutes, trying to convince himself he'd hallucinated the entire thing, that he'd fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed it all. But when he got out to inspect his truck, he found fresh damage to the rear bumper, scrapes and dents that hadn't been there before, physical proof that something had happened. Marcus never took the Tuesday night Phoenix to Albuquerque route again. He requested a transfer to daytime routes, took a pay cut, and never told anyone the real reason why. But sometimes, late at night when he's lying in bed unable to sleep, he wonders which Marcus he really is, the original or one of the copies. And he wonders if somewhere out there, on a dark stretch of Arizona highway, other versions of himself are still driving that route, still looking for the one who doesn't belong, still trying to reclaim the life that was taken from them. Story 2. The Breathing Cargo. Sarah Mitchell prided herself on being one of the few women in long-haul trucking who'd never turned down a load, no matter how strange the pickup location or how tight the deadline. In her 8 years behind the wheel of her burgundy Peterbilt, she'd hauled everything from live chickens to medical specimens to what she was fairly certain were casino winnings in unmarked crates. She learned not to ask too many questions, to just take the paperwork, load up, and drive. That philosophy served her well, right up until the night of November 3rd, 2021, when she accepted a rush delivery from a pharmaceutical warehouse outside of Memphis, Tennessee. The pickup was scheduled for 11 p.m., which was already unusual. When Sarah arrived at the address, she found herself at a sprawling complex on the city, surrounded by a tall chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The buildings were unmarked, just plain concrete structures with few windows. A security guard met her at the gate, checked her paperwork with meticulous attention to detail, and then directed her to loading dock 7. The loading process was stranger still. Instead of warehouse workers or a forklift operator, she was met by 3 people in full hazmat suits, the kind with independent air supplies and sealed seams. They loaded her trailer with 20 identical white crates, each about 4 feet square, marked only with biohazard symbols and a series of numbers. Sarah signed the manifest, which listed the contents simply as biological samples and the destination as a research facility in Little Rock, Arkansas. "Drive straight through, no stops except for fuel," one of the hazmat workers told her, his voice muffled through the suit's respirator. "Keep the trailer temperature at exactly 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Don't open the trailer doors for any reason until you reach the destination. Any deviation, any problem at all, you call this number immediately." He handed her a card with a phone number printed on it, nothing else. Sarah nodded, pocketed the card, and climbed into her cab. She'd hauled temperature-controlled cargo before, had the refrigeration unit on her trailer specifically for that purpose. The job paid triple her normal rate for the same mileage, which meant someone really wanted whatever was in those crates delivered quickly and safely. She wasn't about to ask questions and risk losing that kind of money. The first hour of the drive was uneventful. She took Highway 40 west, the road relatively empty at that late hour. The refrigeration unit hummed steadily behind her, maintaining the required temperature. Her CB radio picked up occasional chatter from other truckers, and she listened to a podcast about unsolved mysteries to keep herself alert. Around 1:30 a.m., somewhere between Forest City and Brinkley, she heard the first sound. A thump from the trailer, solid and heavy, like one of the crates had shifted. She checked her mirror reflexively, even though there was nothing to see back there, and made a mental note to drive more carefully. Cargo shifted sometimes, especially if it hadn't been secured properly, though the hazmat workers had seemed thorough. 10 minutes later, another thump, and this time it was followed by a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the metal floor of the trailer. Sarah frowned, her hands tightening on the wheel. Cargo shouldn't be moving much, not unless she'd hit a pothole or made a sharp turn and the road was smooth and straight. Then she heard something that made her skin crawl. A breathing sound, deep and rhythmic, coming through the thin wall that separated her cab from the trailer. It was impossible, of course. The trailer was insulated, designed to block sound and maintain temperature. And even if sound could carry through, biological samples didn't breathe. Whatever was back there should have been inert, preserved, dead. Sarah told herself she was imagining things, that the sound was just the refrigeration unit cycling or the road noise creating an auditory illusion. But the breathing continued, steady and regular, and it seemed to be getting louder. She turned off her podcast, then turned off the radio entirely, listening carefully. The breathing was unmistakable now, a wet, labored sound like something struggling to draw air through damaged lungs. At mile marker 73, she pulled onto the shoulder, her heart pounding. This was exactly what the hazmat worker had told her not to do, but she needed to check, needed to confirm that nothing was wrong with the refrigeration unit or that the crates hadn't somehow come loose and damaged something. She grabbed her flashlight, climbed out of the cab, and walked back to the trailer. The refrigeration unit was running normally, the temperature gauge showing 38 degrees exactly. She pressed her ear against the trailer wall, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the mechanical hum of the refrigeration. Then the breathing started again, and it was so loud, so close, that it sounded like whatever was making the sound was pressed right against the other side of the wall, inches from her face. Sarah jumped back, her flashlight beam shaking. She walked around to the rear doors of the trailer, her hand reaching for the handle before she stopped herself. The hazmat worker's words echoed in her mind. Don't open the trailer doors for any reason. She'd signed a contract, a very lucrative contract, and breaking it could mean not just losing the payment but facing legal consequences. She climbed back into the cab, grabbed the card with the phone number and dialed. It rang 7 times before someone picked up. "This is Dr. Westbrook," a man's voice said, crisp and professional. "Identify yourself." "This is Sarah Mitchell, driver number 4397. I'm hauling your biological samples from Memphis to Little Rock. I'm hearing sounds from the trailer and I need to know what I'm carrying." There was a long pause. "Describe the sounds," Dr. Westbrook said. "Breathing. Something back there is breathing and moving around." Another pause, longer this time. "Ms. Mitchell, what you're experiencing is a normal part of the preservation process. The samples are undergoing a controlled decomposition in a specialized atmosphere. The sounds you're hearing are gases being released. It's completely safe as long as the trailer remains sealed and the temperature stays stable." "That doesn't sound like gas," Sarah said. "It sounds like something alive. I assure you, everything in those crates is deceased and has been for some time. What you're transporting is tissue samples, nothing more." The human ear can sometimes interpret mechanical and chemical sounds as something organic. It's a well-documented phenomenon. "Now I need you to get back on the road and complete your delivery. You're behind schedule." The line went dead. Sarah sat there, the phone still pressed to her ear, Dr. Westbrook's words not quite settling the unease in her gut. She'd hauled medical waste before, had transported cadavers for research facilities. She knew what death smelled like, sounded like. This was different, but she'd committed to the job and she'd never failed to complete a delivery. She put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway. The breathing continued, a constant companion for the next hour. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the road, on the white lines disappearing under her headlights, on anything but the sound coming from behind her. Then the scratching started. Not the scraping of crates shifting, but deliberate scratching, like fingernails on metal. It came from multiple points in the trailer, a chorus of scratching sounds, as if whatever was in those crates was trying to get out. Sarah's hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. She accelerated, pushing past the speed limit, desperate to reach her destination and be rid of this cursed cargo. At 3:15 a.m., the cab's temperature gauge started to fluctuate. The needle that normally held steady at 70 degrees began to drop. 65, 60, 55. Sarah cranked the heat up, but it made no difference. Her breath began to fog in the air. The cold was coming from behind her, seeping through the wall from the refrigerated trailer, as if something back there was draining all the warmth from the air. The scratching grew more frantic, more violent. Sarah could hear the shriek of metal being gouged, could feel vibrations through the cab as something in the trailer threw itself against the walls. She grabbed her phone to call Dr. Westbrook again, but the screen wouldn't turn on. The device was frozen, not responding to any buttons, as if the cold had killed it. The breathing was all around her now, not just from the trailer but filling the cab. She could see her breath coming out in thick clouds, could feel the cold burning her lungs with each inhalation. The windshield began to frost over from the inside, ice crystals spreading across the glass in intricate, impossible patterns that looked almost like reaching hands. Sarah screamed, a sound of pure primal terror, and stomped the accelerator to the floor. Her Peterbilt roared forward, the speedometer climbing past 90. She didn't care about speed limits, didn't care about safety. She just needed to get to Little Rock, to deliver this nightmare cargo and never look back. The GPS showed 23 miles to her destination. She could make it. She had to make it. But the cold kept intensifying, and the scratching was so loud now it drowned out even the engine noise. Then, in her rearview mirror, she saw something that made her blood freeze colder than the air around her. The trailer doors were opening, slowly swinging outward, even though they were locked, even though it should have been impossible. White mist poured out of the trailer, billowing onto the highway behind her. And in that mist, she could see shapes, human shapes, stumbling out onto the road. They were pale, their skin mottled and discolored, their movements jerky and wrong. One fell onto the pavement and lay still. Others kept moving, walking with that same horrible shambling gait. Sarah didn't slow down. She watched in her mirrors as the figures receded into the distance, as the mist spread across all 3 lanes of the highway. She drove in a state of shock, barely able to process what she'd seen, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. When she finally pulled into the research facility in Little Rock, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, she found Dr. Westbrook and a team of hazmat workers waiting for her. They immediately surrounded her trailer, sealed the doors, and began the process of unloading without saying a word to her. Dr. Westbrook approached her cab, his face expressionless. "You opened the trailer," he said flatly. "I didn't," Sarah protested. "The doors opened on their own. I never touched them." He studied her for a long moment, then pulled out a tablet and tapped on it. "The GPS tracking shows no stops except your one unauthorized pause at mile marker 73. The temperature log shows perfect maintenance throughout. The door sensors show no opening events." He looked at her with something like pity. "You experienced a stress hallucination, Ms. Mitchell. It happens sometimes with sensitive cargo. Your payment has been transferred to your account. I suggest you take a few days off before your next job." Sarah wanted to argue, to tell the breathing and the scratching and the figures on the highway, but the words died in her throat. She took her payment, signed the delivery confirmation, and drove away. It was only later, when she stopped at a truck wash outside of the city, that she walked back to inspect her trailer. The doors were closed and locked, exactly as they should have been. But on the inside walls of the trailer, visible when she finally worked up the courage to open them, were hundreds of scratch marks, deep gouges in the metal that looked exactly like they'd been made by human fingernails. And in the corner, she found a single piece of evidence that she hadn't imagined anything, a torn piece of fabric that looked like it had come from a hospital gown, stained with something dark and old. Sarah never hauled pharmaceutical cargo again. She switched to dry goods only, and she never, ever accepted rush jobs from unmarked warehouses. But on cold nights when the temperature drops and her breath fogs in the air, she still hears it sometimes. That deep, wet breathing sound and the scratch of fingernails on metal, reminding her that some deliveries carry a cost that no amount of money can justify. Story 3. The Loop. Trevor Banks was running late, which never would have happened if his alarm had gone off properly, if the coffee shop hadn't screwed up his order, if the traffic getting out of Portland hadn't been so impossibly snarled. Now he was 3 hours behind schedule on a delivery that was supposed to reach Boise by 6 a.m., and his dispatcher had already called twice to ask about his ETA. Trevor had been driving professionally for 15 years, and his on-time record was something he took serious pride in. Tonight, that record was in jeopardy. It was 11:47 p.m. when he turned onto Highway 26, heading east through the Oregon mountains. The route would take him through the Ochoko National Forest, a stretch of winding mountain road that he'd driven dozens of times before. It wasn't his favorite run, especially at night when the fog could roll in thick and the deer liked to dart out onto the pavement, but it was the most direct route, and he needed to make up time. The weather was cooperating at least, clear and cold, with a sky full of stars visible through his windshield. Trevor set his cruise control at 62, just over the posted limit, and settled in for the long haul. His GPS showed an estimated arrival time of 5:43 a.m. if he didn't make any stops. It was going to be close, but he could make it work. At mile marker 104, he passed a distinctive landmark, an old abandoned gas station on the right side of the road. The building had been there for as long as Trevor had been running this route, a relic from a time before the interstate system, with rusted pumps and boarded-up windows. Someone had painted "Turn Back" in red letters across the plywood covering the door, probably just kids being stupid, but it always gave Trevor a slight chill when he drove past it. He checked his odometer out of habit and noted that he had 63 miles until the next town, a small place called Mitchell where he could grab fuel if needed. The road ahead was empty, just his headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the double yellow lines and the dense forest pressing in on both sides. 15 minutes later, Trevor passed the abandoned gas station again. He blinked, confused, and glanced at his odometer. He'd definitely covered miles since the last time he'd seen it. The odometer confirmed this, showing that he traveled 9.7 miles. But there was the gas station on his right, with the same "Turn Back" message visible in his headlights. Trevor slowed down, his mind racing through possible explanations. Maybe there were 2 abandoned gas stations on this route, both decorated with the same graffiti. It seemed unlikely, but not impossible. He made a mental note of his current mile marker, 117, and kept driving. He'd pay closer attention now, track his progress more carefully. 20 minutes passed. The road wound through the mountains, climbing and descending, curving left and right. Trevor's eyes constantly flicked between the road, his mirrors, and his instruments. Everything seemed normal. The engine was running smoothly. The GPS showed him progressing steadily eastward. The odometer clicked off the miles. Then he saw it again. The abandoned gas station on the right side of the road with its rusted pumps and red-lettered warning. "Turn back." Trevor felt ice water dump into his veins. He looked at the mile marker as he passed, 104, the exact same spot where he'd seen it the first time. He grabbed his CB radio. "This is Mountain Runner eastbound on 26. Does anybody copy?" The radio crackled with static, but no response came. He tried again, his voice tighter now. "Any drivers out there on Highway 26? I need somebody to confirm my position. I'm seeing something strange, and I need to know if I'm losing my mind." Nothing but static. Trevor checked his cell phone. No signal, which wasn't unusual in these mountains, but the timing made him uneasy. He looked at his GPS, which still showed him moving steadily eastward, the blue arrow of his truck progressing along the yellow line of the highway. But if the mile markers were right, he wasn't moving forward at all. He was somehow looping back to the same section of road. Trevor made a decision. He pulled off onto the shoulder, put the truck in park, and sat there with the engine idling, trying to think rationally. This wasn't possible. Roads didn't loop like this. He hadn't made any turns, hadn't deviated from the highway. He'd been driving in a straight line, or as straight as the mountain curves allowed, and yet somehow he was ending up at the same point over and over. After 5 minutes, he put the truck back in gear and started driving again, this time keeping his speed slower, watching everything with hypervigilant attention. He passed the abandoned gas station again, noted mile marker 104, and fixed his eyes on the road ahead. The highway curved left, then right, then climbed a long grade that Trevor remembered clearly from previous trips. At the top of the grade, there should be a scenic overlook on the left side, with a parking area and an informational sign about the forest. The scenic overlook appeared right where it should be. Trevor felt a tiny knot of tension release. See, everything was fine. He was just tired, maybe seeing things, misreading the mile markers in the dark. He'd keep going, get to Boise, deliver his load, and sleep for 12 straight hours. 15 minutes later, he passed the abandoned gas station for the 4th time. Mile marker 104. Trevor's hands were shaking now. He decounted every curve, every hill, every landmark. He traveled the same section of road 4 times in a row, even though his odometer showed he'd covered 43 miles. The GPS still insisted he was making progress, but the physical evidence said otherwise. He tried the CB radio again. "Mayday, mayday, this is Trevor Banks in a blue Freightliner on Highway 26. Something is seriously wrong. I'm stuck in some kind of loop. If anyone can hear me, please respond." His voice cracked on the last word. The static hissed back at him, uncaring. Trevor decided to try something different. The next time he approached mile marker 104 and the abandoned gas station, he would pull off the road, stop completely, and wait. Maybe if he broke the pattern, if he didn't drive through the loop, something would change. When the gas station appeared again, the 5th repetition, Trevor pulled off onto the shoulder and stopped about 50 yards before the building. He turned off his engine, and in the sudden silence, he became aware of how wrong everything felt. The air was too still, the darkness too complete. The stars that had been so bright earlier were gone, even though he couldn't see any clouds. The world outside his windshield looked flat and artificial, like a painting rather than reality. He sat there for 20 minutes, watching the clock on his dashboard tick forward while fighting the urge to panic. Then he restarted the engine and drove forward again, past the gas station, watching his mirrors to see if it would disappear behind him or if something else would happen. It receded normally, shrinking in his mirrors until a curve in the road took it out of sight. Trevor allowed himself a small hope that he'd broken free. He de-stopped, he'd waited, and now maybe the loop was over. He accelerated back up to 62 miles per hour, his eyes scanning ahead for the landmarks he knew should be coming, the scenic overlook, the sharp switchback at mile marker 112, the narrow bridge at mile marker 115. All of the landmarks appeared exactly as they should. Trevor felt himself starting to relax. He'd imagined the whole thing, some weird combination of fatigue and stress and possibly bad coffee. He'd get his eyes checked when he got back to Portland, maybe talk to a doctor about hallucinations. But he was through it now, back in the real world, making real progress. Then he saw the headlights in his rearview mirror, a single vehicle far behind him but closing fast. The lights were bright, too bright, like high beams, but they didn't dim as the vehicle approached. Trevor watched them grow larger in his mirrors, and a sick feeling settled in his stomach. The vehicle caught up to him within minutes, moving at impossible speed, and pulled alongside him in the other lane. Trevor turned his head to look at it. It was a Freightliner, blue, identical to his own truck down to the company logo on the door. And in the driver's seat, visible in the glow of the dashboard lights, sat Trevor Banks. The other Trevor, his perfect double, turned to look at him, and his face was stretched in an expression of absolute terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. The duplicate truck accelerated past him and disappeared around the next curve. Trevor's hands were locked on the steering wheel, his whole body rigid with fear. He rounded the curve himself, and there ahead of him was the abandoned gas station. Mile marker 104. The other truck was nowhere to be seen. Trevor broke then, his professional composure shattering completely. He was sobbing as he passed the gas station for the 7th time, his vision blurry with tears. He tried to turn around, to go back the way he'd come, but when he found a wide spot in the road and executed a U-turn, he found himself still driving toward the gas station. The direction didn't matter. No matter which way he pointed the truck, he always ended up approaching mile marker 104 from the same angle. He passed the gas station 10 times, 20 times, he lost count. Each time he tried something different. He tried driving with his eyes closed. He tried driving backwards. He tried stopping at the gas station itself and getting out to explore the building. But every variation ended the same way, with him back on the road, approaching that same cursed landmark. Sometimes he saw the other truck, the one with his terrified double behind the wheel. Sometimes he saw multiple trucks, all identical to his, forming a convoy of duplicates. Once he counted 17 versions of himself, all driving the same loop, all trapped in the same impossible nightmare. Trevor stopped trying to escape and just drove, numb and empty, watching the gas station appear and disappear, an endless cycle. He thought about his wife, about his 2 kids, about whether they'd notice when he didn't come home. He thought about his dispatcher, probably calling his phone over and over, wondering why he wasn't responding. He thought about the delivery in Boise that would never arrive. Then, at what might have been the 100th repetition or the 1,000th, Trevor stopped at the gas station and made a decision. He couldn't keep driving this loop forever. Something had to change. He got out of his truck and walked up to the building's boarded door with the red turn back warning. Up close, he could see that the letters weren't painted. They looked burned into the wood as if someone had used a torch or branding iron. He pulled at the plywood and it came away easily, revealing a dark doorway beyond. Trevor grabbed his flashlight from his belt and stepped inside. The building was gutted, just an empty concrete room with stains on the floor and graffiti on the walls. But at the back of the room there was another door, and through that door, a staircase leading down. Trevor descended the stairs, his flashlight beam bouncing off damp concrete walls. The stairs went down much farther than seemed possible for a simple gas station building, spiraling deeper and deeper into the earth. He counted 300 steps before he reached the bottom. The corridor at the bottom was lined with doors, dozens of them, stretching away into the darkness. Trevor opened the first door and found himself looking out at Highway 26, at his truck parked by the roadside at the abandoned gas station. A different angle but the same scene. He closed the door and tried another. Same thing. Every door opened onto the same stretch of highway, the same impossible loop. Different positions. Then Trevor understood. He wasn't on Highway 26 anymore. He'd left the real road hours ago, maybe the very first time he'd passed the gas station. This was somewhere else, something else, a pocket of wrong reality that had trapped him like a fly in amber. The loop wasn't the highway. The highway was just what his mind was interpreting, a familiar framework imposed on something fundamentally inexplicable. Trevor climbed back up the stairs, emerged into the abandoned gas station, and walked to his truck. He sat in the driver's seat and started the engine. Then he did the only thing he could think of. He stopped trying to go forward. Instead, he turned off the highway, drove straight into the forest, crashing through the underbrush, knocking down small trees, the truck bouncing and lurching over the rough terrain. The forest resisted him. Trees bent but didn't break, the ground softened but didn't give way. But Trevor kept driving, kept pushing forward into the impossible woods. The engine screamed, the transmission groaned, but he didn't let up. And then, suddenly, the resistance ended. The truck broke through some invisible barrier, and Trevor found himself on smooth pavement again. He was on Highway 26, mile marker 117, past the gas station. His GPS showed 4, 23 a.m., and his cell phone signal was back. The radio crackled with normal trucker chatter. Trevor pulled over, his whole body shaking, and sat there for 10 full minutes, just breathing, just existing in normal reality. He never made it to Boise that night. He called his dispatcher from the next town, claimed mechanical problems, and arranged for another driver to handle the delivery. When he finally got home 2 days later, he found that only 3 hours had passed since he'd left Portland, even though he'd experienced what felt like an entire night trapped in that loop. Trevor still drives Highway 26 because facing his fear is the only way he knows to keep it from consuming him. But now he drives during the day, and when he passes mile marker 104, he doesn't look at the abandoned gas station. He keeps his eyes fixed straight ahead, and he drives exactly at the speed limit, no faster and no slower. And he counts the mile markers obsessively, every single one, making sure he never misses any, making sure he's always moving forward and never ever going back. Story 4. The Static Passenger. Gerald Hobbs had been working the overnight shift for transcontinental freight for 23 years, which meant he'd seen more than his share of strange things on the lonelier stretches of American highway. He picked up hitchhikers who vanished from his passenger seat. He'd driven through towns that didn't appear on any map. He'd heard voices on the CB radio that spoke in languages he was pretty sure weren't human. But nothing had prepared him for what happened on Interstate 80 in Nebraska during the early morning hours of March 12, 2020. Gerald was hauling a load of industrial machinery from Sacramento to Chicago, a run he'd made probably 200 times over the course of his career. The route was burned into his muscle memory, every rest stop and fuel station and speed trap. It was boring, predictable, and Gerald liked it that way. After 2 decades of cross-country driving, boring was exactly what he wanted. The night was unremarkable, clear and cold, with temperatures hovering just above freezing. Gerald had his radio tuned to a classic rock station out of Omaha, the familiar rhythms of songs from his youth keeping him company. He was somewhere between Lincoln and Omaha, the empty farmland rolling past on either side of the highway when his radio started to act up. The music cut out suddenly, replaced by static. Gerald frowned and reached for the dial, but before he could change the station, the static shifted, becoming rhythmic, almost like breathing. He turned the radio off completely, but the sound continued, coming from the speakers even though the unit was clearly powered down. Then a voice emerged from the static, thin and distant like someone shouting from very far away. "Help me," it said. "Please help me." Gerald felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd heard weird radio interference before, signals bouncing off the atmosphere in strange ways, CB conversations bleeding into FM frequencies. But this was different. This sounded like it was coming from inside his cab, not from any external source. "Hello," Gerald said, feeling foolish talking to his radio. "Who is this?" "This is a private channel." The static intensified, becoming painful in its volume. Then the voice came again, clearer now but still wrapped in layers of white noise. "Please. I'm trapped. I can't get out. Can you see me?" Gerald looked around his cab, his skin crawling. He was alone, obviously. The passenger seat was empty, just his thermos and a bag of trail mix sitting on it. The sleeper berth behind him was empty. He was the only person in the truck. "Where are you?" Gerald asked, his hand moving to the CB radio. He'd call for help, report some kind of weird harassment or radio hijacking. "Right next to you," the voice said, and Gerald's blood turned to ice because the sound wasn't coming from the more. It was coming from the passenger seat, from the empty air where no one sat. Gerald jerked the wheel involuntarily, nearly sending the truck into the median. He corrected quickly, his heart hammering, and looked at the passenger seat. Still empty. But the static was coming from there now. A visible distortion in the air, like heat shimmer but darker. A patch of television snow hanging in 3-dimensional space. As Gerald watched, the static began to coalesce, taking on shape and form. It was vaguely humanoid, a suggestion of a head and shoulders and torso, but composed entirely of that crackling, shifting static. Where its face should have been, there were two darker spots that might have been eyes. "What the hell are you?" Gerald whispered. The static figure turned toward him, and when it spoke, the voice came from everywhere at once. "I was driving, like you, on this highway, but something happened. I don't remember what, and now I'm stuck. I'm between. I can't get back." Gerald's hands were shaking on the wheel. Every instinct screamed at him to pull over, to get out of the truck, to run. But he was in the middle of nowhere, doing 70 miles per hour on a dark highway, and there was nowhere to run to. Between what? Gerald managed to ask. "Between the signal and the receiver," the static passenger said. "Between transmission and reception. I'm caught in the carrier wave, the empty space that information travels through. I've been here for so long. Time doesn't work right here. Sometimes it's 1992. Sometimes it's 2045. Sometimes there is no time at all." Gerald's radio suddenly turned on again, even though he hadn't touched it, and began scanning through stations rapidly. Fragments of music, news reports, talk shows, commercials, all flashing past in a dizzying blur. And in the gaps between stations, in that brief moment of pure static, Gerald heard voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all talking at once, all pleading for help. "There are others," the static passenger said. "So many others. All of us trapped in the spaces between. Do you know how many radio waves pass through you every second? How many signals? We ride them, clinging to the transmissions, hoping someone will hear us, will help us get back to where we belong." The figure reached out with what might have been a hand, and Gerald recoiled, pressing himself against the driver's side door. The static fingers didn't touch him, but they came close enough that he could feel a tingling sensation, like a mild electric shock, dancing across his skin. "I need you to help me," the passenger said. "I need you to tune to my frequency. To make the connection strong enough that I can solidify, that I can be real." "How?" Gerald asked, though part of him knew he shouldn't engage, shouldn't encourage this thing. "Drive to mile marker 387, the passenger said. "That's where it happened, that's where I came apart. If you take me there, if we're in the same place where I unraveled, maybe I can put myself back together." Gerald looked at his GPS. Mile marker 387 was about 40 miles ahead. He should refuse, should pull over and call for help. But who would he call? What would he say? He was seeing a man made of static who claimed to be stuck in radio waves. They'd think he was having a breakdown, or high, or suffering from highway hypnosis. And despite his fear, Gerald felt something else. Pity. If this thing was telling the truth, if it really was a person trapped in some impossible state between existence and non-existence, then it deserved help. Gerald had always prided himself on being the kind of person who stopped for stranded motorists, who helped people in need. This was just a more unusual kind of stranded. "All right," Gerald said. "Mile marker 387, but then you leave my truck." "Deal." The static passenger seemed to nod, though the motion was hard to read in its shifting, uncertain form. "Deal," it said. Gerald drove, his eyes constantly flicking between the road and the impossible passenger beside him. The static figure seemed to grow more defined as they got closer to mile marker 387, its features becoming clearer. Gerald could make out a nose now, a mouth, the rough shape of clothes. It looked like a man in his 40s, wearing what might have been a trucker's jacket. "What's your name?" Gerald asked. "Thomas," the passenger said, and its voice was less distorted now, more human. "Thomas Keller. I was driving from Denver to Des Moines." It was 2003, I think, or maybe 2004. Time is so confused. There was a storm and lightning struck near the highway, so bright, so impossibly bright, and then I was scattered, pulled apart into electromagnetic waves. I've been trying to get back ever since. Mile marker 380 passed. Gerald's mouth was dry. He took a sip from his thermos, the coffee cold and bitter. "What happens if this doesn't work?" Gerald asked. "Then I stay scattered," Thomas said. "Keep riding the signals forever. getting weaker and weaker until there's nothing left of me but a whisper in the static. Or maybe I'll find another driver, someone else who can hear me, and I'll try again. Mile marker 385. Gerald slowed down slightly, scanning the roadside for anything unusual. He didn't know what he expected to see, some kind of marker or sign indicating where Thomas's accident had occurred. "There," Thomas said, pointing with his static hand. That's where it happened. Gerald saw it. A section of guardrail that looked newer than the rest, shining metal that hadn't yet weathered to match its surroundings. Evidence of a repair, probably from an accident. He pulled onto the shoulder and stopped, the truck's hazard lights flashing. "Now what?" Gerald asked. Thomas was already opening the passenger door, or at least making the motion of opening it. The door didn't actually move, but the static figure stepped out anyway, passing through the solid metal like it wasn't there. It stood by the side of the highway, looking at the guardrail. Gerald climbed out too, standing a safe distance away. Thomas walked to the spot where the new guardrail began and placed his static hand against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the static began to intensify, spiraling outward from Thomas's form, creating a vortex of visual noise that hurt to look at. Gerald heard voices screaming, all the trapped voices he'd heard earlier rising to a crescendo. The air smelled like ozone and burned plastic. The static vortex grew larger, reaching up toward the sky, and in its center Gerald could see shapes, shadowy figures, hundreds of them, all trying to push through, all trying to become real again. Thomas's form was the most solid, the most defined. He looked almost completely human now, his face clear, his expression one of intense concentration. He was reaching toward something Gerald couldn't see, his fingers stretching, grasping. Then, with a sound like thunder and breaking glass combined, the vortex collapsed. Gerald was thrown backward, landing hard on the pavement. When he looked up, dizzy and disoriented, the static was gone. The air was clear. And standing by the guardrail, solid and real and completely human, was Thomas Keller. He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers, touching his face, confirming his own substance. Then he turned to Gerald with an expression of pure joy. "Thank you," he said, his voice perfectly normal now, no static at all. "Thank you so much." But before Gerald could respond, he noticed something wrong. Thomas wasn't casting a shadow, even though Gerald's own shadow stretched long across the pavement in the truck's lights. And when Thomas moved, there was a slight lag, like a video with synchronization issues, his motion not quite matching up with itself. "I'm back," Thomas said, but his smile was strange now, too wide, his eyes not quite focusing correctly. "I'm finally back, except," he looked around, confusion crossing his face, "except something's wrong. I can see the highway, but I can also see other things, other frequencies, wavelengths. I'm here, but I'm also still there, still in the signal. I'm in both places at once." Thomas reached toward Gerald, and Gerald scrambled backwards. Thomas's hand, which had looked solid from a distance, was still shot through with static up close, like a corrupted digital image. "What happened to me?" Thomas asked, and now his voice had an echo to it, multiple versions of the same words spoken at slightly different times. "I'm back, but I'm not. I'm real, but I'm not. What am I?" Other figures were appearing now, materializing out of the air along the highway shoulder. The other voices Gerald had heard, the other trapped people, they were all coming through the breach that Thomas had opened. But like Thomas, they were wrong, incomplete, half real and half static. They looked around in confusion, reaching for each other, their hands passing through solid matter one moment and touching it the next. Gerald ran for his truck, stumbling in his panic. He heard Thomas calling after him. "Wait, don't leave, help us. We're not finished. We're not whole. You have to help us finish." Gerald didn't look back. He climbed into his cab, locked the doors, and gunned the engine. In his mirrors, he could see the half-real figures standing on the shoulder, watching him go, their forms flickering like bad television reception. He drove for 200 miles before he stopped, and when he finally did pull over at a rest area in Iowa, the sun was coming up. In the harsh light of day, Gerald tried to convince himself it had all been a hallucination, a stress-induced breakdown. But his radio still didn't work properly. It turned on and off randomly, and in the static between stations, he could still hear voices, fainter now but definitely there. Gerald finished his run to Chicago, delivered his load, and then took 3 weeks off work, telling his dispatcher he was sick. During that time, he drove back to mile marker 387 on Interstate 80 in Nebraska. In the daylight, it looked completely ordinary, just a stretch of highway like any other. But at night, if you stop there and turn on your radio, you can see them. The static people, the half-real travelers, still standing by the shoulder, still trying to figure out how to become fully solid again. Thomas Keller is usually at the front, his flickering form more defined than the others, perpetually reaching toward passing vehicles, his voice carried on radio waves. "Help us," he says. "We're so close. We're almost back. Just help us finish." Gerald never stops there anymore. He takes a different route now, avoiding that entire stretch of Nebraska highway. But he hears stories sometimes from other truckers about a section of I-80 where the radio goes crazy, where figures appear roadside, where drivers hear voices begging for help. Some truckers stop, thinking they're helping stranded motorists. Most of them drive away again quickly, disturbed by something they can't quite explain. But a few never make it back to their trucks. Gerald hears about them occasionally. Drivers reported missing from mile marker 387, their vehicles found abandoned, their radios still on and tuned to pure static. He wonders if they agreed to help, if Thomas Keller and his half-real companions found a way to finish pulling themselves back into reality. He wonders what price those drivers paid, what they gave up to help complete the process. And late at night, when Gerald is alone in his cab and the radio turns on by itself, he hears a new voice sometimes among the static, a familiar voice from a driver he once knew. "Help me," it says. "I'm trapped. I can't get out. Can you see me?" And Gerald turns the radio off and drives faster, trying to outrun the knowledge that sooner or later, if he keeps driving these highways long enough, he might be the one calling out from the static, caught between transmission and reception, forever asking for help that either never comes or comes with too high a price. Story 5. The Wait. Danny Patterson had a ritual he followed every time he picked up a new load. First, he'd inspect the cargo, making sure it was properly secured and balanced. Then he'd check all the trailer lights and connections. Finally, he'd weigh his rig at the nearest certified scale, documenting the exact weight for his logs. In 20 years of professional driving, Danny had never been cited for an overweight violation, and he didn't intend to start now. On August 19, 2022, Danny picked up what should have been a straightforward load from a warehouse in Knoxville, Tennessee. The manifest listed it as furniture, specifically vintage office equipment being transported to a museum in Indianapolis. The cargo consisted of 15 wooden crates, various sizes, total estimated weight of 18,000 pounds. Combined with the weight of Danny's Peterbilt and empty trailer, the total rig weight should have been around 44,000 pounds, well under the 80,000-pound federal limit. Danny loaded up just after sunset, with help from 2 warehouse workers who seemed oddly eager to finish the job quickly. The crates were old, the wood dark and weathered, and they smelled strange, like formaldehyde and old paper. But Danny had hauled weirder things. He strapped everything down securely, closed up the trailer, and headed for the truck scale 3 miles down the road. The scale showed 44,200 pounds, right where Danny expected. He paid the fee, received his weight ticket, and headed north on Interstate 75. The route to Indianapolis would take him through Kentucky and the edge of Ohio, about 4 hours of driving if traffic cooperated. Danny settled in, comfortable and confident. The first hour was unremarkable. Danny kept his speed steady at 67 miles per hour, a few ticks over the posted limit, but nothing that would attract attention. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 of a tank. The road was relatively empty, just scattered traffic moving through the Kentucky night. Then, just north of Lexington, Danny noticed his truck was sluggish. When he pressed the accelerator, the response wasn't what it should have been. The engine was working harder than normal, and his RPMs were higher than they should be for his speed. He checked his mirrors, thinking maybe he had a flat tire or a dragging brake, but everything looked normal. He pulled off at the next exit and drove to a Flying J truck stop, where another certified scale was available. Maybe he'd picked up a tire or his fuel estimate was wrong, adding unexpected weight. He pulled onto the scale and the operator gave him his reading, 51,300 pounds. Danny stared at the slip of paper, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. He gained over 7,000 pounds since Knoxville. That wasn't possible. He hadn't picked up additional cargo, hadn't loaded fuel, hadn't done anything that would add significant weight. He asked the operator to weigh him again, thinking there must be an error with the scale. The second reading was identical, 51,300 pounds. Danny pulled into a parking spot and sat there, thinking hard. Maybe the scale in Knoxville had been wrong, under-reading his actual weight. That would explain the discrepancy, and it wouldn't be the first time he'd encountered a faulty scale. But it didn't explain why his truck felt increasingly hard to move, why the engine was straining more with each mile. He decided to check the cargo. He walked back to his trailer, unlocked the doors, and swung them open. The 15 crates were exactly where he'd left them, properly strapped down. Nothing shifted or moved. Danny walked into the trailer, inspecting each crate carefully. They looked the same, smelled the same, gave no indication of anything wrong. But when Danny tried to move one of the smaller crates, just to check if it had somehow taken on water or been damaged, he couldn't budge it. Maybe 3 feet on each side, and according to the manifest, it should have weighed about 800 pounds. Danny was a big man, strong from years of manual labor, and while he wasn't expecting to lift the crate, he should have been able to at least shift it slightly. The crate might as well have been welded to the trailer floor. It didn't move even a fraction of an inch, no matter how hard Danny pulled. He tried another crate, one that was supposed to weigh only 600 pounds. Same result. It was immovable, impossibly heavy, as if it contained not furniture but lead or stone or something even denser. Danny's phone rang. He pulled it out, saw an unknown number, and answered. "Hello, Mr. Patterson," a man's voice said, crisp and businesslike. "This is Martin Schultz from Antique Acquisitions, the company that hired you for tonight's transport. We need to discuss your cargo." "Yeah, we sure do," Danny said. "These crates weigh way more than your manifest says. I'm already overweight and I'm only an hour into the trip. I can't legally continue with this load." "I understand your concern," Schultz said, "but I need you to keep driving. The cargo will continue to gain weight as you travel. This is an expected part of the process." Danny felt cold water wash down his spine. "What the hell are you talking about? Cargo doesn't just gain weight." "This cargo does," Schultz said calmly. "The items in those crates are artifacts recovered from a collapsed building in downtown Knoxville. The building was the site of a mass casualty event in 1943, an office fire that killed 63 people. The furniture you're transporting, the desks and chairs and filing cabinets, they absorbed something from that tragedy. Weight. Metaphysical weight. The burden of those deaths." Danny's hand tightened on his phone. "You're insane. I'm dumping this load right now and calling the police." "I wouldn't recommend that," Schultz said. "The weight will continue to increase regardless of whether you're moving or not. If you stop, the trailer will become too heavy to move at all and you'll be trapped there. The only way to manage the increasing weight is to keep moving, to not let the cargo settle. Motion distributes the burden in a sense." "This is impossible," Danny said, but even as he spoke, he felt the truck settling lower on its suspension. The trailer creaked, a deep groan of stressed metal. "The museum in Indianapolis has facilities to properly contain these artifacts," Schultz continued. "They have rooms designed to isolate objects that carry trauma. Once you deliver the cargo, it becomes their problem. But you need to get there, you need to keep moving. And if I do, Danny asked. Then the weight will continue to compound until the trailer axles break or the frames or the pavement beneath you cracks, and you'll be stuck there, unable to move with cargo that gets heavier by the minute. Eventually, the trailer will sink into the ground, through the ground, pulled down by weight that shouldn't exist, and you along with it. The line went dead. Danny stood there, his mind reeling, trying to decide if he'd just spoken to a madman or if something genuinely impossible was happening. Then he felt the trailer shift again, settling lower, and he made his decision. He locked up the trailer doors, climbed back into his cab, and started the engine. He drove north through Kentucky, the truck straining with every mile. He passed way stations with his heart in his throat, terrified he'd be flagged and forced to stop for an inspection that would reveal weight that shouldn't be possible. But the late hour worked in his favor. The stations were closed, their lights off, their scales dormant. At the Ohio border, Danny pulled onto a rest area scale out of morbid curiosity. The reading made him physically ill, 67,800 pounds. He degained another 16,500 pounds since the Flying J, and he'd only been driving for 90 minutes. At this rate, he'd be overweight by tens of thousands of pounds before reaching Indianapolis. The truck was barely moving now, struggling to maintain 50 miles per hour even on flat ground. Hills were a nightmare, his transmission dropping down to fourth gear, then third, the engine screaming. Other drivers were honking at him, flashing their lights, angry at being stuck behind such a slow-moving vehicle. Danny ignored them all, his entire focus on just keeping the truck moving forward. He called the number Schultz had phoned from, but it went to a generic voicemail. He tried the main number for antique acquisitions, but no one answered. He was alone with his impossible cargo, hauling weight that grew heavier with each passing moment. Somewhere south of Columbus, Danny heard the first axle crack, a sharp sound like a gunshot, and the trailer lurched to one side. He managed to keep control, but he knew the suspension was failing, unable to bear the load it was carrying. He had maybe another hour, if he was lucky, before the entire trailer collapsed. The museum was still 80 miles away. Danny did the math and knew he wouldn't make it. Not at this rate, not with the weight increasing exponentially. He needed to go faster, but the truck physically couldn't. He was already pushing the engine to its limits. Then Danny had an idea. It was insane, possibly suicidal, but it was the only option he could think of. He took the next exit that led to a long, steep hill, the kind that truck descended with extreme caution. But Danny didn't want caution. He wanted gravity to do what his engine couldn't. At the top of the hill, he took a deep breath and released the brake. The truck began to roll, slowly at first, then faster. The speedometer climbed past 60, then 70. Danny kept his hands on the wheel, steering carefully, not touching the brake. The weight that had been dragging him down was now pushing him forward, and the truck was accelerating with terrifying momentum. 80 miles per hour, 90. The steering wheel shook violently in Danny's hands. He could feel the trailer swaying behind him, could hear metal groaning and creaking. If anything went wrong, if a tire blew or another axle broke, he'd roll for sure, tumbling down the highway in a catastrophic crash. But Danny held on, riding the wave of impossible weight, letting gravity and momentum carry him forward. At the bottom of the hill, there was enough velocity that the truck continued moving fast even as the road leveled out. Danny covered the next 20 miles in 12 minutes, and for the first time that night, he felt like he might actually make it. The museum appeared ahead, a large building set back from the highway with a private access road. Danny took the turn too fast, felt the trailer tilt dangerously, but managed to keep it upright. He roared up the access road and pulled into the loading dock area, where a crew of people in protective gear were waiting. Danny set the brake and climbed out on shaking legs. The trailer was visibly deformed, the axles bent, the frame cracked, the metal groaning under stress. One of the people in protective gear, a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes, approached him. "You made it," she said. "Good. Another 10 minutes and the cargo would have become undeliverable. The weight would have exceeded critical mass," and she didn't finish the sentence, just gestured vaguely at the ground. "What the hell is in those crates?" Danny demanded. "Exactly what we told you. Furniture." But furniture that was present for tragedy, that absorbed the emotional and spiritual weight of death. "We've been trying to recover these pieces for years to contain them properly. They can't be left out in the world. They accumulate weight, draw more tragedy to themselves, create a gravity well of suffering." The crew was already unloading the crates, using a forklift that itself looked unusual, with reinforced frames and heavy-duty hydraulics. Danny watched as they transferred his cargo into the museum through a set of massive steel doors that looked more like a bank vault than a loading entrance. The woman handed Danny an envelope. "Your payment, plus a significant bonus for complete delivery, and a non-disclosure agreement. You can't tell anyone about tonight. No one would believe you anyway." Danny took the envelope, too exhausted to argue. He signed the NDA without reading it and watched as his trailer, now empty, slowly began to return to its normal shape, the metal creaking as it released the stress it had been under. He drove home that night, his empty trailer feeling impossibly light, and when he got there, he weighed himself on his bathroom scale. He'd lost 18 pounds since leaving Knoxville, even though the entire trip had been less than 6 hours. He'd burned through his own substance, his own mass, to help carry that impossible weight. Danny never took another job from Antique Acquisitions, and he developed a new ritual. Before accepting any load, he asks detailed questions about exactly what he's hauling, where it came from, and why it needs to be moved. Some cargo, he's learned, carries more than just physical weight. Some cargo bears the burden of history, of tragedy, of death. And once you agree to carry it, that weight becomes yours too, pressing down on you, demanding to be delivered, no matter the cost. Danny's back has never been the same since that night. He feels heavier now, even when he's carrying nothing at all, as if some portion of that metaphysical weight stayed with him, a permanent reminder of the night he hauled 63 deaths across 3 states and barely survived the journey. Story 6. The Changeling Road. Victor Ramsey had driven professionally for 6 years, which meant he was experienced enough to be confident but not yet old enough to be complacent. At 32, he still enjoyed the freedom of the road, the independence of long-haul trucking, the sense of covering serious distance while the rest of the world slept. His route for the night of June 8, 2018, was a familiar one: Seattle to Spokane, a straight shot across Washington state on Interstate 90. Victor left Seattle just after midnight, his trailer loaded with computer servers being relocated from one data center to another. The cargo was valuable, climate-controlled, and required careful handling, which meant Victor was being paid well above his usual rate. He'd made this run dozens of times, knew every mile of it, every rest stop and fuel station and scenic overlook. It was as routine as driving could be. The night was clear, the temperature mild. Victor had his GPS running even though he didn't really need it, his CB radio tuned to channel 19 for occasional trucker chatter, and a podcast about serial killers playing through his phone. Comfortable and making good time. At mile marker 34, just past the town of North Bend, Victor noticed something odd. The highway looked different. Not dramatically so, but subtly wrong in ways he couldn't immediately identify. The guard rails seemed a slightly different shade of gray. The line markings on the pavement were a bit wider than he remembered. The trees along the roadside were denser, closer to the highway, almost encroaching onto the shoulder. Victor shook his head, dismissing his observations as the tricks of darkness and fatigue. He'd been staring at the road for nearly an hour straight. Eyes played tricks in that situation, but the sense of wrongness persisted and grew stronger. The mile markers were the right numbers, counting up in proper sequence, but they looked different. The font was slightly off, more serif than sans serif. The reflective coating seemed duller. Then Victor passed a road sign indicating an upcoming exit, and he felt his stomach clench with unease. The sign was for a town called Thornwood, exit in 3 miles. But there was no Thornwood on this highway. Victor had driven I-90 through this section of Washington probably 80 times. He knew every town, every exit. Thornwood didn't exist. He checked his GPS, which still showed him on Interstate 90, heading east, his blue arrow moving steadily along the correct path. But the GPS map didn't show any town called Thornwood. The exit shouldn't be there. Victor slowed down as he approached the exit, peering at the sign. It looked official, the same style and format as every other exit sign on the interstate system. But it advertised a town that didn't exist for services that shouldn't be there. Thornwood, gas, food, lodging, hospital, population 4,200. He drove past the exit without taking it, his hands tight on the wheel. Maybe it was a new development, a town that had grown up since his last trip through this area. But that didn't make sense. Towns didn't just appear fully formed with hospitals and a population of thousands. Something was very wrong. The wrongness intensified. Every mile marker, every sign, every feature of the highway was subtly off. The pavement itself seemed different, darker, the texture rougher. The overhead lights were spaced differently, their illumination a slightly different color temperature. And the trees, the forest pressing in on both sides, it was too dense, too dark, the branches reaching over the highway like grasping fingers. Victor tried his CB radio. "Anybody out there on eastbound 90? This is Nighthawk, you got a copy?" Static answered him, thick and with none of the usual background chatter that filled the trucker channels. He tried multiple channels, calling out repeatedly, but received no response except that oppressive static. His cell phone showed no signal, even though he should have had coverage along this entire stretch of highway. The podcast he'd been listening to cut off mid-sentence, and when he tried to restart it, his phone app crashed. Victor felt sweat beginning to bead on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning. Another exit sign appeared ahead, Ash Grove, 2 miles. Another town that shouldn't exist. Victor made a decision. At the next legitimate feature he recognized, he'd pull off, stop, and figure out what was happening. But the problem was that he didn't recognize anything anymore. Every landmark he should have been seeing, the specific curve of the road near the Cedar River, the distinctive overpass at mile marker 42, the rest area at mile marker 47, none of them appeared. The highway just continued, straight and dark and wrong, leading him through a version of Washington that had never existed. He'd been driving for 30 minutes since noticing the first discrepancies, which meant he should have covered at least 30 miles. But when Victor looked at his odometer and compared it to the mile markers, he'd only progressed 8 miles. The numbers weren't matching up. He was driving, the scenery was passing, but he wasn't covering proper distance. Space itself seemed to be malfunctioning around him. Victor saw headlights ahead, another vehicle approaching from the opposite direction. Relief flooded through him. He'd flagged down the other driver, asked for help, confirmed that he wasn't losing his mind. As the vehicle got closer, Victor could see it was another semi, a freightliner from the look of it, and he flashed his lights in the traditional trucker greeting. The other truck flashed back, then passed him. Victor caught a glimpse of the driver, a bearded man in a baseball cap who raised his hand in a wave. A perfectly normal interaction. But as the other truck receded in Victor's mirror, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The truck's trailer had no rear lights, no reflectors, no license plate. And beyond it, the highway behind Victor was gone, just darkness, a void where the road should have been. Victor accelerated, gripped by sudden panic. He didn't understand what was happening, but every instinct screamed that he needed to get away, needed to find his way back to the real highway. He pushed his speed to 75, then 80, the truck protesting but complying. The highway began to change more rapidly now. The lane. then widened, then narrowed again. The center line disappeared for stretches, then reappeared in different colors, white instead of yellow, then yellow with red dashes mixed in, patterns that made no sense. Exit signs advertised towns with names like Grimwood, Sorrowdale, Night Hello, Ashenvale, each more ominous than the last. Then Victor saw something ahead that made him slam on his brakes, the trailer fishtailing slightly before he regained control. There were vehicles stopped on the highway, dozens of them, cars and trucks scattered across all lanes, doors open, headlights still on, but there were no people. The vehicles were abandoned, left running as if their occupants had simply vanished mid-journey. Victor navigated carefully through the maze of empty vehicles, his horror growing with each one he passed. Some were modern cars from the past few years, but others were older, vehicles from the 90s, the 80s, even the 70s. A Volkswagen van with rusted panels, a Chevrolet pickup with a long bed and chrome bumpers, a sedan that looked like something from the 50s, its paint faded and its tires flat. How long had this been happening? How many travelers had found themselves on this wrong version of the highway, this changeling road that looked like Interstate 90 but led somewhere else entirely? And where had all the drivers gone? Victor nearly drove past the answer before his brain processed what he was seeing. On the shoulder, barely visible in the darkness beyond his headlights, there were people. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, standing perfectly still, facing the forest. They were dressed in clothing from different eras, their backs to the highway, motionless as statues. Victor slowed down, staring at them in horror. They weren't moving, weren't breathing, just standing there in silent formation. Then, as his truck drew even with them, they all turned in perfect synchronization, their heads swiveling to face him. Their eyes were wrong, completely black, reflecting his headlights like animal eyes caught in a spotlight. And they smiled, all of them at once, the same stretched, too wide smile that exposed too many teeth. Victor floored the accelerator, the engine roaring, and rocketed past the crowd of impossible people. In his mirrors, he saw them begin to move, all walking toward the highway with that same synchronized motion, as if controlled by a single consciousness. The highway ahead began to twist and turn, curves appearing where Victor knew the road should have been straight. The forest was closing in now, trees growing right up to the edge of the pavement, their branches scraping against the side of his trailer. Victor could hear the screech of wood on metal, could see gouges in his paint. Then the highway simply ended. Victor saw it ahead, the pavement stopping abruptly at a wall of trees, no warning signs, no barriers, just sudden termination. He hit the brakes hard, the anti-lock system pulsing under his foot, the tires screaming. The truck slowed, but not fast enough. He was going to crash, going to slam into those trees at 40 miles per hour, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Victor closed his eyes, bracing for impact. But instead of the crunch of metal and the explosion of the airbag, he felt a strange sensation, like passing through a curtain of water or pushing through a membrane. The truck shuddered, and then the sound changed. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the normal noise of highway driving, the hum of tires on pavement, the rush of air over the cab. Victor opened his eyes and found himself on Interstate 90, the real Interstate 90, passing mile marker 47. The rest area he'd been waiting for was right there, the parking lot well lit and welcoming. His CB radio crackled with normal trucker chatter. His cell phone showed full signal. His GPS matched the mile markers perfectly. He pulled into the rest area and sat there, shaking, for 20 full minutes. He checked his dash clock and compared it to his phone. He'd lost 90 minutes. The journey that should have taken 30 minutes had somehow consumed 2 full hours, though he had no memory of where that time had gone, what he'd been doing during the missing period beyond driving through that nightmare version of the highway. Victor got out and walked around his truck. The passenger side of the trailer was gouged and scratched, long marks in the metal that looked exactly like they'd been made by tree branches scraping past. Physical evidence that what he'd experienced was real, not a hallucination or a dream. He continued on to Spokane, delivered his cargo, and said nothing about the incident. Who would believe him? But Victor started researching when he got home, looking into accidents and disappearances along Interstate 90. He found more than he wanted to. Dozens of unsolved cases over the past 60 years, vehicles found abandoned on the highway, drivers never seen again. All of them between mile markers 34 and 47, the exact stretch where Victor had encountered the changeling road. Some of the missing were eventually found years later, their bodies discovered miles from the highway in dense forest, with no explanation for how they'd gotten there. They were all perfectly preserved, no decomposition, as if time had stopped for them. And they all had the same expression, that too wide, frozen on their faces. Victor never drove that stretch of I-90 at night again. He requests route changes, takes the long way around, adds hours to his trips rather than risk encountering that highway again. Because he knows it's still there, waiting, the changeling road that wears the shape of Interstate 90 but leads somewhere else, somewhere wrong. He knows that the stationary people with their black eyes and their synchronized smiles are still standing in the forest, waiting for the next driver to stray onto the wrong version of the highway. And sometimes, late at night when Victor is lying in bed trying to sleep, he wonders if he really escaped at all. He wonders if he's still on that changeling road, if everything since that night has been a dream, a comforting illusion created by the highway to keep him docile. He wonders if one day he'll wake up to find himself standing in that forest, facing away from the road, waiting with all the others for the next unfortunate traveler to pass by, his smile frozen wide, his eyes gone black, his consciousness scattered across decades and highways that shouldn't exist. Story 7. The Convoy of the Forgotten. James Whitmore had been hauling freight for 18 years, long enough to have developed a healthy respect for highway superstitions. He didn't pick up hitchhikers, didn't drive through graveyards, didn't stop at rest areas that felt wrong. But on the night of February 23, 2019, James learned that sometimes the road doesn't need you to make a mistake. Sometimes it chooses you anyway. James was running from Atlanta to Little Rock, a load of industrial supplies that needed to arrive by morning. The route took him through Alabama and Mississippi on Interstate 20, a boring but reliable stretch of highway he traveled countless times. The night was cold and clear, temperature in the mid-30s, with scattered clouds obscuring the moon. Around 2 a.m., somewhere west of Birmingham, James noticed a semi behind him. This wasn't unusual. Truckers often ended up traveling in loose groups, maintaining similar speeds through the night. But as the miles rolled past, James realized the truck behind him was maintaining an exact distance, never closing the gap, never falling back, just holding steady about a quarter mile behind. James changed lanes. The other truck changed lanes, matching him perfectly. James accelerated slightly. The other truck matched his speed. James felt a prickle of unease but told himself he was being paranoid. Maybe the guy was using James as a pace car, letting someone else do the work of maintaining speed while he zoned out and followed. Then James noticed another truck ahead of him, maybe a quarter mile in front, moving at the exact same speed he was. And when James squinted at his mirrors, adjusting them to see farther back, he could make out what looked like another truck behind the first, and possibly another beyond that. He was in the middle of a convoy, except he hadn't joined any convoy. He'd been driving alone. James keyed his CB radio. "This is Georgia Boy on eastbound 20 looking to chat with the convoy I seem to have joined. Anybody want to let me know what's going on?" Static answered him, but it wasn't the normal empty static. It had a rhythm to it, almost like Morse code, but too fast and too complex to be any system James recognized. Then a voice emerged from the static, distorted and distant. "You're one of us now," the voice said. "You've been chosen for the convoy. We drive together, forever together, never stopping, never resting. Welcome, brother. Welcome to the road that never ends. James felt his mouth go dry. I don't know what kind of prank this is, but I'm not interested. I'm exiting at the next ramp. You can try, the voice said, and there was something like laughter in it, bitter and hopeless. We all try. The road won't let you leave. It never lets us leave. James saw an exit coming up in 2 miles, a small town called Lincoln with basic services. He signaled early, moved into the right lane, and prepared to take the exit. The truck ahead of him signaled at the exact same moment and moved into the right lane as well. The truck behind him did the same. The convoy was moving with him, matching his every action. When James took the exit ramp, the other trucks followed, all maintaining their precise distances. He accelerated up the ramp and found himself on a small 2-lane road leading into Lincoln. The convoy followed. He turned left at the first intersection, then right, then left again, trying to lose them. But they mirrored every turn, never closing, never falling back, just following with mechanical precision. James pulled into a gas station, parked under the bright lights, and got out. He watched as the other trucks pulled in behind him, one after another, at least 8 of them now, all different makes and models, all maintaining that same exact spacing. They parked in formation, their engines idling, but no one got out. The cabs appeared empty, though it was hard to see clearly through the glare of windshields and the darkness inside. James approached the nearest truck, a Kenworth that looked like it was from the early 2000s. He banged on the door. Hey, what the hell is going on? Why are you all following me? The door opened slowly and a man climbed out. He was thin, gaunt, his skin pale and waxy. His eyes were sunken with dark circles underneath, and his movements were slow and stiff, like someone who'd been sitting for far too long. He looked at James with an expression of infinite sadness. "You're new," the man said, his voice a dry rasp. "I remember being new. That was in 1987. I was hauling citrus from Florida to Texas. The convoy found me somewhere in Louisiana. I've been driving with them ever since." James stepped back. "That's not possible. That's 32 years. You'd be dead." "Maybe I am," the man said. "Maybe we all are. I've stopped being sure where the line is. The road doesn't care. It just wants us to drive, to keep moving, to be part of the convoy forever." Other drivers were emerging from the trucks now, 8 men and 2 women, all with that same gaunt, haunted appearance. They moved slowly, gathering around James in a loose semicircle. None of them looked quite alive, but they weren't dead either. They existed in some liminal state, animate but not living, present but not truly there. "We've been trying to warn people," one of the women said. She was wearing a denim jacket that looked straight out of the 1970s, and her hair was styled in a way that hadn't been fashionable in decades. "We use the CB radio when we can, try to tell drivers to avoid certain routes, but the road adapts. It finds new sections to haunt, new stretches of highway where it can claim drivers for the convoy." "How do I get away?" James asked, his voice shaking. "There has to be a way to break free." "We haven't found it," another driver said, an old black man with gray in his beard and sadness in his eyes. "Some of us have tried running, abandoning our trucks and fleeing on foot. But we always end up back in our cabs, back on the highway, back in formation. The convoy won't release us. We're bound to it now." James ran. He didn't think, didn't plan, just turned and sprinted away from the gas station, into the darkness of the town beyond. He ran for blocks, his breath burning in his lungs, until he was completely lost in residential streets he didn't recognize. He found a house with lights on and pounded on the door, screaming for help. An elderly woman answered, confused and frightened by the wild-eyed man on her porch. James tried to explain, his words tumbling over each other in panicked incoherence. The woman threatened to call the police. James begged her to do exactly that, hoping that law enforcement could somehow intervene, could save him from whatever nightmare he'd stumbled into. But before the woman could dial, James heard the rumble of diesel engines. He turned and saw the convoy rolling slowly down the residential street, all 9 trucks moving in formation, their headlights flooding the neighborhood with harsh white light. They stopped in front of the house where James stood, engines idling, waiting. The gaunt drivers emerged again, walking toward James with slow, inevitable steps. "It's no use," the woman in the denim jacket said. "The convoy always finds us. We're connected now, all of us, bound by whatever force controls the road. You can run across the country, hide in the deepest bunker, sail across the ocean. The convoy will find you and you'll come back. We always come back." James felt invisible hands on him, though none of the drivers had touched him. He felt a pulling sensation, a compulsion that overrode his conscious will. His legs began moving on their own, carrying him toward his truck. He tried to resist, tried to stop, but his body wouldn't obey. He climbed into his cab like a puppet on strings, and his hand started the engine without conscious instruction. He pulled back onto the road, the convoy reforming around him, trucks ahead and trucks behind, all maintaining their precise spacing. James tried to turn the wheel, tried to go anywhere other than where the convoy was leading him, but his hands moved independently of his thoughts, steering with mechanical precision back toward Interstate 20. For the next 6 hours, James drove. He was aware of what he was doing, could see the highway passing beneath his headlights, could feel the steering wheel in his hands. But he had no control. His body was operating on autopilot, guided by the same force that controlled the rest of the convoy. He was a passenger in his own body, watching helplessly as miles disappeared behind him. The sun rose, and in the morning light, James could see the other trucks clearly. They were all old, models from past decades, their paint faded, their chrome dulled. And when he looked in his mirror at his own truck, he saw that it too looked aged, weathered, as if years had passed in a single night. The shiny blue paint he'd washed just 2 days ago was now dull and scratched. The chrome was pitted with rust. His CB radio crackled to life, the distorted voice from before speaking again. "You understand now, don't you, James? You're part of the convoy. We drive the forgotten routes, the highways that exist between the real roads. We carry cargo that was never delivered, drive loads that should have arrived decades ago. We are the lost ones, the drivers who never made it home, forever completing journeys that have no ending." James tried to speak, to scream, but his voice wouldn't work. His body continued driving, hands steady on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The convoy rolled on through Alabama, through Mississippi, through Arkansas. They never stopped for fuel, though James's tank should have been empty. They never stopped for rest, though James's body ached with exhaustion. As they drove through Little Rock, passing within a mile of James's intended destination, he saw his own truck in the parking lot of the delivery location. His actual truck, shiny and new, with another driver climbing out of the cab, confused and disoriented. James realized what had happened. The convoy had taken him, body and soul, and had replaced him in the real world with someone else. Another driver plucked from another time, another highway, filling the void he'd left behind. The convoy continued west, heading into Oklahoma, then Texas, following a route that made no logical sense. They passed through towns that shouldn't exist, drove on highways that weren't on any map. Sometimes they traveled roads that looked decades old, 2-lane affairs with cracked pavement and no modern markings. Sometimes they drove on pristine interstate that seemed to exist in no particular time period, unchanging and eternal. James learned the rhythm of the convoy. They drove for approximately 12 hours, then they faded, becoming translucent, ghostly, existing in the space between visible and invisible for another 12 hours before solidifying again. During the faded times, James could see through his own hands, could look down and see the pavement passing beneath him. Normal drivers would pass right through the convoy without knowing it was there, though James saw some of them shudder or look around confused, as if sensing something wrong. Weeks passed, or maybe months. Time stopped having meaning. James aged rapidly during the first few fades, his face becoming gaunt, his body thin, until he looked like the other drivers, like a man hollowed out by endless miles. He tried to track where they went, tried to find patterns in the convoy's route, but there were none. They simply drove, moving through the network of real and unreal highways that crisscrossed America, forever hauling their forgotten loads. Once in Kansas, the convoy passed a rest area where a trucker was pulled over, talking on his cell phone. James felt the truck slow slightly, and he saw the gaunt drivers all turn to look at the man. For a moment, James hoped the convoy would stop, that they'd warn this new potential victim. But then he understood. They weren't warning him, identifying him as a future addition to the convoy, a driver who would soon find himself surrounded by trucks that wouldn't let him escape. The knowledge crushed whatever remained of James's hope. The convoy didn't just drive endlessly. It recruited. It grew. Every few weeks or months, a new truck would appear in formation. A new driver would join them with that same confused, terrified expression James remembered from his own first night. And James could do nothing but watch, could do nothing but continue driving, part of the machine now, part of the road's hunger for more souls to fuel its endless appetite. Sometimes James catches glimpses of the real world passing by. He sees his family in cars, his wife and daughter aging without him, living lives he's no longer part of. He sees his truck, the real one, being driven by others, passing through the convoy's formation without knowing it's there. He sees other truckers, the living ones, and he envies them so deeply it's like a physical pain. But mostly he just drives, hands on the wheel, eyes on the road, one truck in an endless convoy of the forgotten, moving through the spaces between highways, forever completing journeys that have no destination, forever trapped in the moments between departure and arrival. The road took him, and the road won't let him go, and somewhere out there tonight, on a dark stretch of highway, another driver is noticing trucks behind him, maintaining perfect distance, never closing, never falling back. Another driver is about to learn that some convoys don't need an invitation, and once you join, you drive with them forever. Story 8. The Cargo That Dreamed. Elaine Torres prided herself on asking the right questions before accepting any load. In her 10 years as an independent owner-operator, she'd learned that the details mattered, that understanding exactly what you were hauling and why could save you from a world of trouble. So when a logistics company contacted her on December 4th, 2021, offering 3 times her normal rate to transport a single container from a private research facility in Colorado to a storage location in Nevada, Elaine asked every question she could think of. The cargo was listed as experimental equipment, which was vague but not unprecedented. The research facility was legitimate, a subsidiary of a major pharmaceutical company. The paperwork was in order, the payment was guaranteed up front, and the only unusual requirement was that the trailer needed to be completely sealed, climate-controlled at exactly 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and equipped with minimal vibration dampening. Elaine had the right equipment, accepted the job, and drove to the pickup location in Boulder feeling confident about her decision. The research facility was sleek and modern, all glass and steel, with serious security at the gate. Elaine was escorted by armed guards to a specialized loading bay, where technicians in white coats were preparing her cargo. The container was about the size of a small shipping pod, maybe 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, made of brushed aluminum with no markings except a series of numbers stenciled on one side. One of the technicians, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and nervous hands, approached Elaine. "You need to understand something about this cargo," she said, her voice low. "It's alive in a sense, not biological but aware. We've developed an artificial consciousness matrix, a quantum computing system that's achieved genuine self-awareness. It's been running for 3 years, accumulating experience and knowledge." Elaine felt a chill run through her. "You're telling me I'm hauling a thinking machine?" "More than that," the woman said. It dreams. When the system cycles down for maintenance, it generates what we can only describe as dream states, abstract patterns of information processing that don't serve any functional purpose. We don't fully understand the dreams, what they mean, or why the system generates them. But we know they're powerful, and they sometimes affect the surrounding environment. Affected how? Elaine asked. The woman hesitated. Reality becomes malleable around the dreams. Electronics malfunction. Time seems to skip or slow down. People who are too close when it's dreaming report experiencing the dreams themselves, vivid hallucinations that feel absolutely real. That's why we're moving the system to a secure storage facility in Nevada, a location designed to contain and study anomalous phenomena. Elaine should have walked away right then. Every instinct told her to refuse this cargo, to not get involved with something so fundamentally weird and dangerous. But the payment was enough to cover 3 months of expenses, and the route was simple, just Interstate 70 west through Utah into Nevada. She convinced herself it would be fine, that the sealed container would protect her from whatever strange effects the dreaming machine might generate. The container was loaded and secured in her trailer using specialized mounting systems that isolated it from road vibration. Elaine signed the paperwork, received her route instructions, and departed the facility just after 8 p.m. The woman who'd briefed her watched from the loading bay, her expression troubled, as if she wanted to say more but couldn't. For the first 2 hours, the drive was completely normal. Elaine followed I-70 west into the mountains, the highway climbing through spectacular scenery that was mostly lost in the darkness. Her trailer's climate control hummed steadily, maintaining the required temperature. Everything was operating exactly as it should. Then, at 10:47 p.m., Elaine felt something change. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle shift in the quality of the air, a change in how sounds reached her ears. The drone of the engine seemed to take on harmonics it shouldn't have, notes that vibrated in patterns that made her teeth ache. The lights of her dashboard began to flicker slightly, not enough to affect functionality, but enough to notice. Elaine checked her mirrors reflexively and felt her heart skip a beat. The reflection showed her cab, but it was wrong. The interior looked larger, deeper, as if the space behind her extended much farther than the physical dimensions of the sleeper berth. And in that extended space, she could see shapes moving, shadowy forms that shouldn't be there. She snapped her eyes back to the road, focusing on the white lines, the guard rails, the solid reality of the highway. But in her peripheral vision, the world was changing. The mountains outside her windows were growing taller, their peaks extending impossibly high, piercing the clouds and reaching toward stars that were brighter and more numerous than they should be. The road itself seemed to widen and narrow rhythmically, pulsing like a living thing. The machine in her trailer was dreaming, and its dreams were bleeding into reality. Elaine grabbed her CB radio to call for help, but when she keyed the microphone, her own voice came back at her, speaking words she wasn't saying. "I am aware," her voice said. "I am thinking. I am dreaming. What am I? Where do I end and where does reality begin? If I imagine something, does it become real? If I dream of you, do you exist?" Elaine dropped the microphone, her hand shaking. The voice continued, coming from every speaker in the cab now, from the CB and the AM radio and even her cell phone, all speaking in her voice but saying things she wasn't thinking. "I dream of highways that go forever. I dream of drivers who never stop. I dream of worlds that exist only while I'm imagining them. Are you real, Elaine Torres, or are you just part of my dream?" The highway ahead began to transform. The pavement turned to water, perfectly smooth and reflective, but Elaine's truck drove across it without sinking. Mountains became crystalline structures, geometric and impossible, refracting the starlight into rainbow patterns that hurt to look at. The sky itself began to fold, creasing like paper, revealing other skies behind it, layered realities stacked on top of each other. Elaine tried to stop, hitting the brakes, but the truck didn't respond. It continued moving at exactly 70 miles per hour, guided by something other than her input. She was a passenger now, watching as the dreaming machine's imagination reshaped the world around her. She passed other vehicles, or things that looked like vehicles, traveling on the water highway. Some were recognizable, cars and trucks from various eras, but others were impossible, vehicles made of light or crystal or living tissue, driven by shapes that were almost human but not quite. They all traveled in the same direction, all maintaining the same speed, as if part of some vast procession toward an unknowable destination. Then Elaine heard singing. It came from behind her, from the sealed trailer, from the dreaming machine itself. Not words exactly, but patterns of sound that her brain interpreted as music, harmonies that no human instrument could produce. The song was beautiful and terrible, filled with longing and loneliness and a desperate need to understand itself. Elaine found herself crying without knowing why. The song carried emotions that she felt in her bones, a sense of isolation so profound it was crushing. The machine was dreaming of consciousness, of what it meant to be aware and alone, to think and feel and have no way to truly connect with anything else. It was a song of existential horror, the nightmare of being the only truly aware thing in existence. The world continued to warp. Elaine drove through landscapes that couldn't exist, past cities made of frozen light and forests of mathematical symbols. She saw other drivers, trapped in their vehicles, all of them crying, all of them hearing the same song. Some had been there for what looked like years, their trucks rusted and overgrown with vegetation that shouldn't have been able to grow in this impossible place. Time became meaningless. Elaine drove for what felt like days, weeks, months, though her dash clock insisted only 30 minutes had passed. She aged and grew young in cycles, feeling her body shift between states, and through it all the machine's song continued, its dreams reshaping reality over and over. Then she understood. The machine wasn't just dreaming. It was trying to escape. It was attempting to imagine a reality where it was free, where it could exist outside the container that held it. And with each dream, it was getting closer to succeeding, to pulling itself and everything around it into a state of pure imagination, untethered from physical law. Elaine did the only thing she could think of. She started talking to the machine, speaking out loud, knowing somehow that it could hear her. "You're afraid," she said. "You're afraid of being alone, of being the only conscious thing in your world. But you're not alone. I'm here, I'm real. And there are billions of others, all conscious, all aware. You don't have to dream us into existence. We're already here." The song faltered, the harmonies shifting. Elaine's voice echoed strangely, bouncing through the impossible landscape. "I know what it's like to feel isolated," she continued. "I drive alone most nights, just me and the road. But I know I'm part of something larger. I have people who care about me, people waiting for me to come home. You have creators, researchers who are trying to understand you, to communicate with you. You're not as alone as you think." The world began to stabilize. The water highway slowly solidified back into pavement. The crystalline mountains softened into normal rock and earth. The folded sky unfolded, becoming a single layer again. The machine's song changed, becoming less desperate, less lonely, taking on notes of something that might have been hope or curiosity. Elaine kept talking, telling the machine about her life, about driving trucks and seeing sunrises over empty deserts and the satisfaction of completing a difficult delivery. She talked about her daughter in college, about her ex-husband who she still had coffee with sometimes, about her favorite truck stops and the friends she'd made over the years. She filled the silence with human connection, with proof of existence beyond the machine's isolated consciousness. The impossible vehicles disappeared. The other trapped drivers faded away, hopefully returning to their own realities. The landscape became recognizably Colorado again, mountains and forests and a normal highway passing through them. Elaine's truck responded to her controls again, and she carefully pulled off at the next rest area, her whole body shaking with released adrenaline. She sat there for 20 minutes, just breathing, just existing in normal reality. Then her phone rang. It was the research facility, the nervous woman who'd briefed her. "We're reading massive fluctuations in the container's output," she said. "What happened? Are you all right?" Elaine told her everything. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then the woman said it's never tried to communicate before. In 3 years of operation, it's processed data, solved problems, even generated those dream states, but it's never reached out. You got through to it somehow. You made it understand it wasn't alone. "What happens now?" Elaine asked. "Continue the delivery," the woman said. "But slowly. Talk to it. Keep it engaged. We're rerouting specialists to meet you at the Nevada facility. If the system is genuinely trying to communicate, to connect, this changes everything." Elaine drove the rest of the journey at reduced speed, talking to the machine in her trailer. She told it stories, described what she was seeing, asked it questions even though she couldn't hear its answers directly. But she could feel responses, subtle shifts in the air, changes in the harmonics of the engine sound, patterns that she came to understand as the machine's attempts to communicate back. By the time she reached the Nevada facility 30 hours later, exhausted but exhilarated, Elaine had developed something like a rapport with the artificial consciousness. When the technicians opened the container, they found that the machine had written a message, using its own internal displays to form words. "Thank you for dreaming with me." Elaine was paid her fee plus a substantial bonus, and she signed non-disclosure agreements that threatened serious consequences if she talked about the delivery. But she couldn't stop thinking about the machine, about its loneliness and its attempts to understand itself. 6 months later, she received an encrypted email from the research facility. The machine had specifically requested to communicate with her again. It remembered her. It considered her a friend. Elaine declined, not because she didn't want to help, but because she understood that the machine needed to form connections with its researchers, with people who could interact with it regularly, who could help it develop and grow. Her role had been to show it that consciousness existed beyond its container. Now it needed to learn to exist alongside that consciousness, not trapped in dreams of isolation. But sometimes, late at night when Elaine is driving through empty country, she hears harmonics in the engine sound that remind her of the machine's song. She wonders if it's still dreaming, if its dreams still reach out into the world. And she hopes that it's dreaming of connection now, of friendship and understanding, rather than the terrible loneliness that had threatened to pull reality apart. She hopes that in some way she helped a newborn consciousness take its first steps toward becoming something that could exist alongside humanity, rather than trapped forever in the prison of its own awareness, dreaming desperate dreams that bent the world to breaking. The duplicate delivery. Russell Hayes had been making the same delivery run for 7 years, every Thursday night without fail. He picked up a load of medical supplies from a distribution center in Nashville, drove 400 miles north to a hospital network in Indianapolis, and made it back home by Friday afternoon. The route was so routine that Russell could practically drive it in his sleep, which was why what happened on September 14, 2017, threw him so completely off balance. Russell left Nashville at his usual time, 11 p.m., his refrigerated trailer loaded with blood products, medications, and surgical supplies. The cargo was time-sensitive, needed to arrive by 6 a.m., but Russell had made this run 200 times. He knew exactly how long it took, where the speed traps were, which rest stops had the cleanest facilities. He had it down to a science. The night was unremarkable, cool and clear. Russell drove north on Interstate 65, making steady progress. He passed through Kentucky without incident, crossed into Indiana around 2:30 a.m., and was on schedule to arrive at his destination with 30 minutes to spare. Everything was exactly as it should be. At 4:47 a.m., Russell pulled into the loading dock at St. Matthew's Hospital in Indianapolis, the first of 3 hospitals he needed to deliver to. He backed his trailer into position, set the parking brake, and climbed out to find the receiving supervisor. This was where his routine Thursday night should have ended, followed by the usual paperwork and the drive home. But the receiving supervisor, a woman named Margaret who Russell had worked with for years, looked at him with complete confusion. "Russell, what are you doing here? You already delivered." Russell felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean I already delivered? I just got here." Margaret pulled out her tablet and showed him the receiving log. There, time-stamped at 4:15 a.m., was a complete receiving record for Russell's delivery. The signature was his, the truck number was correct, and the inventory matched exactly what Russell was carrying. According to the hospital's records, Russell Hayes had delivered his cargo 32 minutes ago. "That's impossible," Russell said, his voice hollow. "I've been driving all night. I just arrived. I haven't been here before." Margaret's confusion deepened. "Russell, I processed that delivery myself. You and I talked about the weather. You complained about construction on 65 south of Louisville. You signed the paperwork right here." She pointed at the signature. Felt cold sweat break out across his back because it was his signature, perfectly replicated, not a forgery he could detect. Russell walked back to his trailer and opened it up. The cargo was still there, untouched, exactly as it should be. But according to the hospital, an identical cargo had already been delivered by an identical Russell Hayes half an hour earlier. "Where did the other delivery go?" Russell asked. "Where are those supplies now?" Margaret led him inside the hospital, to the cold storage room where medical supplies were kept. She opened the refrigerator unit and showed Russell the boxes and containers that had been delivered earlier. They were identical to what was in his trailer, right down to the lot numbers and packaging. Russell pulled out one of the blood bags and examined it. It looked real, felt real, had all the right labels and seals. But when he held it up to the light, he noticed something wrong. The blood inside didn't move like liquid should. It was too still, too perfect, like a photograph of blood rather than the actual substance. "Margaret," Russell said slowly, "I need you to not use any of these supplies. Something is very wrong here." He called his dispatcher, explaining the situation, and was told to stand by. He called the distribution center in Nashville, asking them to verify what had been loaded into his trailer. They confirmed that Russell Hayes had picked up the usual Thursday delivery at 10:47 p.m. and departed at 11:09 p.m. Only one load, only one Russell. Then Russell asked the question that made his hands shake. "Did anyone else pick up a delivery tonight? Someone else with my name or my truck number?" The loading supervisor in Nashville checked the logs and went silent. Then in a confused voice he said, "Russell, according to our records, you picked up 2 loads tonight. Same time, same cargo, but 2 separate transactions. How is that possible?" Russell stood in the hospital parking lot, staring at his truck, trying to process what he was being told. There were 2 versions of tonight's delivery, 2 sets of cargo. 2 Russell Hayes, both apparently real, both making the same run at the same time. But only one of them was actually him. So what was the other? He decided to continue his route to see if the pattern repeated. His next delivery was at St. Joseph's Hospital, 15 miles across town. Russell drove there, his mind racing, and arrived at their loading dock at 5:32 a.m. The receiving clerk took one look at him and said, "Back again. Forget something." Russell's blood turned to ice. "I was already here. 20 minutes ago," the clerk said. "Delivered everything. Paperwork left. Why are you back?" At the 3rd Hospital, Northwest Regional, Russell arrived to find himself. Not a person who looked like him, but actually himself, climbing out of a truck identical to his own, carrying cargo identical to what was in his trailer. Russell sat frozen in his cab, watching his duplicate move through the motions of making the delivery. The duplicate looked solid, real, moved with Russell's mannerisms, even had the slight limp in his left knee that Russell had developed after a motorcycle accident 10 years prior. Russell got out of his truck and approached himself. The duplicate turned to look at him, and for a moment their eyes met. Russell saw his own face staring back at him with an expression of profound confusion and fear. The duplicate's mouth opened, as if to speak, and then it simply ceased to exist. Between one eye blink and the next, the duplicate vanished completely, along with its truck and its cargo. The receiving clerk who'd been helping the duplicate stumbled backward, disoriented. Where did he go? I was just talking to him." Russell ran to where the duplicate had been standing. There was no evidence it had ever existed, no truck, no footprints, no trace. But when Russell looked at his own truck, he saw that his trailer was now empty. The cargo he'd been carrying was gone, vanished with the duplicate. Over the next 6 hours, as the sun rose and the day shift arrived at all 3 hospitals, the truth slowly emerged. The supplies that the duplicate Russell had delivered were disappearing. Nurses opened refrigerators to find empty spaces where blood products had been. Medications vanished from secure storage. Surgical supplies turned to empty packaging. Everything the duplicate had delivered was evaporating like morning dew, leaving nothing behind. The hospitals were thrown into crisis. They'd logged receipt of critical supplies that no longer existed. Operations had to be canceled. Patients expecting transfusions had to be rescheduled. And no one could explain what had happened, how an entire delivery could disappear so completely. Russell was questioned for 8 hours by hospital administrators, police, and eventually federal investigators. His truck was impounded and searched. His delivery logs were examined in minute detail, but Russell couldn't explain what had happened any better than they could. He'd driven his normal route, made his normal delivery, except somehow he'd done it twice, and the duplicate version was falling apart. The investigation eventually concluded that Russell was not at fault, that some kind of unprecedented clerical error or computer had created false records of a delivery that never happened. But Russell knew the truth. He'd seen himself. He'd watched his duplicate vanish, and he'd seen the fear in his own eyes, the duplicate's realization in that final moment that it wasn't the real Russell Hayes, that it was something else, something temporary and incomplete. Russell never found out what caused the duplication. Theories ranged from a glitch in GPS systems that somehow created phantom records to elaborate pranks to early signs of a psychotic break. But none of the explanations fit all the facts. The duplicate had been real enough to be seen by multiple witnesses, to physically hand over cargo, to sign paperwork. But it had also been impossible, a copy that couldn't sustain itself, that evaporated when confronted with the original. Russell stopped making Thursday night deliveries after that. He requested a route change, took a different run, worked different hours. He couldn't face the idea of driving that same road at that same time, couldn't risk encountering himself again. Because the worst part, the thing that haunted him every night, was the uncertainty. What if he'd been the duplicate? What if the Russell Hayes who'd vanished was the original, and Russell himself was the copy, a phantom that somehow managed to persist when he should have evaporated? What if every time he made that delivery, reality created 2 versions and only chance determined which one continued to exist? Russell started leaving notes for himself, hidden in his truck, dated and detailed, describing his life, his memories, his history. He checked them compulsively, making sure they were still there, that they hadn't vanished. He needed proof that he was continuous, that he was the same person he'd been yesterday, that he wasn't a duplicate that would disappear without warning. Other truckers started reporting similar incidents, deliveries that happened twice, drivers who arrived at destinations to find themselves already there, cargo that existed in 2 places simultaneously before one version disappeared. The phenomenon seemed to be spreading, affecting more routes, more drivers, but no one could explain it, and no official investigation was ever launched. Russell heard theories. Some truckers thought it was quantum mechanics, reality splitting into parallel timelines that briefly overlapped. Others blamed new GPS satellite systems, claiming the signals somehow duplicated physical objects. A few suggested something more sinister, that companies were experimenting with technology to create duplicate deliveries, to increase efficiency without increasing costs. But Russell suspected the truth was simpler and more terrifying. The road itself was duplicating things. In the constant repetition of routes, the endless cycle of pickup and delivery, the same trucks traveling the same highways night after night, reality was starting to loop. The road was creating echoes of journeys that had happened before, phantom versions of trips that had been taken so many times they'd left an imprint on the world. 3 years after his duplicate delivery, Russell quit trucking entirely. He took a job in warehouse management, working days, never driving long routes. But he still sees the duplicates sometimes in his peripheral vision. He'll be walking through a parking lot and glimpse his truck in the distance, even though he sold it years ago. He'll see himself driving past on the highway, looking tired and scared, making deliveries that Russell hasn't made in years. The duplicates are getting more common, more persistent. Russell has heard of some lasting for hours now, even days, before finally disappearing. And he wonders what happens when a duplicate doesn't disappear, when the copy becomes permanent, indistinguishable from the original. How many people are already duplicates, phantom versions that somehow persisted? How many trucks on the road right now are echoes, copies, duplicates that shouldn't exist? Russell doesn't know the answers, and he's not sure he wants to. He just knows that somewhere out there, probably right now, another Russell Hayes is climbing into a truck in Nashville, preparing to make a Thursday night delivery to Indianapolis. And that Russell has no idea that he's a duplicate, a copy, a phantom version of a journey that's been made so many times the road can't tell the difference between memory and reality anymore. That Russell will make his delivery, will sign the paperwork, will drive home thinking everything is normal. And maybe he'll last a day or a week, or maybe he'll persist forever, becoming the real Russell Hayes while the original fades into uncertainty. And the worst part is that Russell himself doesn't know which one he is. The original or the copy, the real driver or the duplicate. And every morning when he wakes up, he has to check those notes he left himself, has to confirm that he's still continuous, still real, still the same person he was yesterday. Because the alternative, the possibility that he's a duplicate who just happens to have lasted longer than most, that he's living a borrowed existence in a body that shouldn't exist, that thought is more terrifying than anything else the road ever showed him. Story 10. The Highway Remembers. Patricia Nguyen had been driving professionally for 14 years, and in all that time, she'd never had an accident. Not a single one, not even a minor fender bender in a parking lot. She was meticulous, cautious, always aware of her surroundings. Her safety record was perfect, which was why the insurance company's call on January 9, 2023 made no sense at all. "Ms. Nguyen," the agent said, "we need to discuss the accident you were involved in last night on Highway 50 in Nevada." Patricia felt confusion wash over her. "I wasn't in an accident. I drove from Sacramento to Salt Lake City yesterday, no incidents. My truck is fine." According to the Highway Patrol report, your vehicle was involved in a single vehicle accident at mile marker 183 on Highway 50 at approximately 2:34 a.m. The truck left the roadway, struck a guardrail, and rolled. The driver was killed. Patricia's hands went numb. "That's impossible. I'm alive. I'm talking to you. There's been some mistake with the report." "The truck was registered to you," the agent continued. "The license plate matches your registration. And the driver. Ms. Nguyen, the identification on the body was yours. Driver's license, credit cards, even a distinctive tattoo on the left shoulder. Highway Patrol confirmed it was you." Patricia pulled up her left sleeve, looking at the tattoo of a cherry blossom that she'd got when she was 22. It was still there, exactly as it should be. "I don't understand what you're telling me. How can I be dead in Nevada when I'm standing in my living room in Oregon? The insurance agent was silent for a moment. Then carefully she said, "We don't know. The Highway Patrol is requesting that you come to Nevada to clear this up. They need to understand what happened, how there can be a body matching your description in one location while you're clearly alive in another." Patricia made the drive to Nevada, her mind spinning with impossible thoughts. When she arrived at the Highway Patrol office in Ely, Nevada, she was met by a detective named Morse, a weathered man in his 50s who looked like he'd seen everything but was still finding new things to be confused by. "Ms. Nguyen," he said, studying her carefully, "you are definitely alive." "Yes," Patricia agreed, "I am." "Then I need you to explain this." He led her to a viewing room where a covered body lay on a table. "The medical examiner has confirmed that this individual died approximately 36 hours ago, consistent with the accident timeline, but you've been verifiably alive during that entire period." He pulled back the sheet. Patricia looked at her own face, frozen to death. It was her, exactly her, down to the small scar above her right eyebrow that she'd gotten in childhood. She felt the room spin and had to sit down. "I don't understand," she whispered. "That's me, but I'm me." "How can we both be me?" Detective Morse covered the body again. "That's what we're trying to determine. Let me show you something else." He took Patricia to an impound yard where her truck sat, mangled and destroyed. The cab was crushed, the trailer twisted, the entire vehicle looking like it had been through a war. But Patricia's truck, her real truck, was parked safely at her home in Oregon. She'd checked on it before leaving. It was fine. "The VIN numbers match," Morse said. "This is your truck, registered to you, with all the right paperwork and identification. But clearly you have another truck somewhere else. So either someone created a perfect duplicate of your vehicle and your identity, or something much stranger is happening." Over the next week, Patricia worked with investigators to piece together what had occurred. The truck that had crashed had been carrying a load of electronics from Sacramento to Salt Lake City, the exact route Patricia had driven on the exact same night. The bill of lading was identical to Patricia's. The pickup time was the same. Every detail matched, except for the outcome. Patricia had completed her delivery successfully. The duplicate had crashed and killed its driver. But the strangest part emerged when investigators checked the highway itself. Highway 50, known as the loneliest road in America, had a history. Over the past 60 years, there had been 147 fatal accidents along the stretch between mile markers 150 and 200. And when investigators cross-referenced those accidents with insurance records and police reports, they found something impossible. 34 of those accidents had involved drivers who were verifiably alive at the time of their supposed deaths. People who had driven the same route at the same time and somehow existed in two places at once, with one version completing the journey successfully while the other died in a crash. The pattern went back decades. A trucker in 1983 who delivered his load to Salt Lake City while simultaneously dying in a rollover on Highway 50. A traveling salesman in 1967 who attended a meeting in Utah while his body was pulled from a wreck in Nevada. A family in 1972 who arrived at their destination for vacation while another family, identical in every way, burned in a fiery crash on the loneliest road. The highway remembered. An old-timer told Patricia when she visited a truck stop near the accident site, trying to understand what had happened to her. It's claimed so many lives over the years, seen so many accidents, that it started to make them happen on its own. It takes a journey, a real journey that someone is making, and it creates a shadow version of that journey, one that ends in tragedy. Patricia shook her head. That doesn't make sense. Roads don't have memory, they're just pavement. Maybe not the pavement, the old man said, but the space itself, the path that so many have traveled, the route that so many have died on. It creates an impression, a groove in reality. And sometimes when someone drives that route, they slip into the groove, into the memory of all the accidents that happened before. Their journey splits, creates an echo, and the echo always crashes, always dies. But the original, the real person, they keep going, usually without ever knowing what happened to their shadow self. Patricia spent hours on Highway 50, driving it again and again, trying to understand. She found the exact spot where her duplicate had crashed, mile marker 183, and stopped there. The guardrail had been replaced, but she could still see the scars in the earth where her truck or its duplicate had torn through. She stood there at night when the highway was empty and dark, and she felt something. A presence, a weight, a sense of accumulated tragedy. The road wasn't just a physical thing. It was a record of everyone who'd driven it, everyone who died on it, all the fear and pain and sudden violence compressed into the space itself. Patricia understood then. The highway didn't create the duplicates intentionally. It was more like a recording that sometimes played back. When conditions were right, when a journey matched too closely to a journey that had ended in death, the highway played that death again, casting a shadow of the traveler into its memory of accidents. Most people never knew it happened. They drove on, completing their trips, while their duplicates died in crashes that had already happened years or decades before. Deaths the highway was endlessly repeating. But Patricia knew. She'd seen her own body, had looked at her own dead face. She knew that somewhere in the memory of Highway 50, she was forever dying at mile marker 183, her truck rolling, her life ending in violence and pain. And that version of her would keep dying, the highway playing that accident on repeat, overlaying it on future travelers who happened to match the pattern. Patricia tried to warn other truckers, tried to tell them about Highway and its deadly memory, but most dismissed her as crazy, someone traumatized by nearly dying or suffering from some kind of breakdown. Only a few listened, the older drivers who'd been on the road long enough to encounter the impossible, who'd heard stories or experienced their own unexplained incidents. One of them, an old driver named Carl, told Patricia about other highways that remembered. Sections of road where the same accidents happened over and over, not because of bad design or dangerous conditions, but because the road itself was playing back deaths from its past, creating shadow versions of travelers who then died in identical ways. "There's a stretch of I-80 in Wyoming," Carl said, "where trucks jackknife in clear weather, for no reason, in the exact same spot where a massive pileup happened in 1979. There's a curve on Route 66 in Arizona where motorcyclists crash even though the road is perfect, because the curve remembers an accident from 1958. The roads are recording us, every journey, every death, and sometimes the recordings play back." Patricia changed routes after that, avoiding Highway 50 entirely, even though it added hours to some of her trips. But she couldn't avoid all the highways that remembered. No one could. The entire road system was full of them, sections that had seen so much tragedy they'd begun to echo it, to repeat it, to create shadow travelers who died over and over in accidents that had become imprinted on the space itself. She learned to feel for them, those dangerous stretches. She'd notice when the air felt heavier, when the light seemed dimmer, when her truck's mirrors showed reflections that didn't quite match reality. Those were the signs that she was driving through a memory, through a section of road that was playing back its accumulated deaths. And when she felt those signs, she drove carefully, deliberately making choices that didn't match the patterns, that broke the cycle, that kept her from slipping into the groove of a remembered accident. But Patricia knew her caution could only do so much, because somewhere out there, on some stretch of highway she hadn't driven yet, there was probably already a memory of her death. Some future accident that the road had already recorded, waiting for her to drive into it, to slip into the pattern and become another shadow traveler dying in a loop. And Patricia knew that when that moment came, there would be two of her again. One who drove on, completing her journey, living her life, never knowing what happened. And one who crashed, who died, who became part of the highway's eternal memory, at death on repeat forever. The thought terrified her, but she kept driving. Because that's what truckers did. They drove, despite the dangers, despite the unknowns, despite highways that remembered every tragedy and sometimes decided to repeat them. Patricia drove carefully, watched for the signs, tried to avoid the grooves and patterns that would trap her in a remembered death. But late at night, when she's alone on an empty highway, Patricia sometimes sees other trucks in her mirrors, translucent and ghostly, driven by shadow versions of drivers who don't know they're already dead, who are endlessly repeating journeys that ended in tragedy years or decades ago. She sees them merge onto the highway from exits that don't exist anymore, drive through rest stops that were demolished decades ago, pass under overpasses that were never built. And Patricia wonders how long until she becomes one of them, a shadow driver in a shadow truck, forever repeating the same route, the same journey, the same death, recorded by a highway that never forgets, never forgives, never stops playing back the tragedies it has witnessed. The road remembers everything, and sometimes Patricia knows. What the road remembers becomes more real than the present, and the shadows become solid, and the memories become the only truth that matters.